Beatrice's voice cut through the Austin cattle auction, the smell of dust and money thick in the air. Clara is just the hired help, gentlemen. We keep her around to check hooves, not write checks. The wealthy ranchers laughed. I didn't flush. I didn't cry. I simply adjusted my clipboard. They thought I was a charity case, but I was the silent investor in their version of family. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our Revenge Mode community today. I was 28 years old, and my uncle Silas and Aunt Marion had raised me since I was 6. Raised is a generous term. They housed me. In their minds, family affection was a business transaction, and I was a depreciating asset. Even though my veterinary skills had single-handedly saved their prime cattle herds from a devastating outbreak 2 years ago, I was perpetually reminded of my debt. I was the outsider, the charity case living on borrowed time and stolen grace. The trap of cruel normalization is incredibly insidious. When you grow up in a house where emotional cruelty is served with breakfast, you stop recognizing the taste of poison. Marion and Silas never screamed. They didn't have to. They used casual dismissals, heavy sighs, and public humiliations to constantly reinforce my place at the bottom of the ledger. They had normalized their cruelty so completely over the decades that their friends, their neighbors, and even their biological children believed I deserved it. It wasn't parenting. It was psychological subjugation designed to keep me perpetually grateful for scraps. Back at the auction, the heat in the arena was stifling. Silas was sitting in the front row, his ego visibly bruised after losing a casual debate about livestock yields to a rival rancher. To save face, he started bidding on a prime breeding bull. The numbers climbed rapidly. 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. He didn't even have the proper infrastructure for this specific breed, but his pride was on the line and reason had left the building. The gavel finally fell at $35,000. Silas stood up, beaming as the crowd applauded his extravagant, foolish purchase. But then he turned to me, his smile dropping into a cold, expectant sneer. He walked over, the heavy boots thudding against the wooden bleachers, and handed me the auction invoice. "Settle this, Clara," he ordered, his voice loud enough for the neighboring rows to hear. I stared at the paper, reading the exorbitant number. "I don't have this kind of capital sitting around." "Your clinic sits on my land, Clara," Silas said smoothly, adjusting his hat. "Pay for this bull, or I terminate your lease tomorrow. Consider it a small repayment for the decades we spent putting a roof over your head, feeding you, and tolerating your presence." He expected me to panic. He expected me to beg or cry in front of the entire assembly. Instead, anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for the family I thought I had. But there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. They were cashing in on my loyalty, completely unaware that their account was about to be permanently closed. I walked toward the cashier's desk, my boots heavy on the sawdust-covered floor. Every eye in the auction house felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I pulled out my checkbook, the leather worn from years of careful, meticulous budgeting. $35,000. It was the exact amount I had painstakingly saved over 4 years to expand my independent veterinary clinic. Every late-night emergency calving call, every skipped meal, every holiday weekend, sacrificed on the altar of hard work, all wiped out by a single, forced stroke of a pen. My hands trembled slightly as I wrote the numbers, carefully spelling out $35,000 in ink. Beatrice was watching me from the lower bleachers, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. Warren, my spineless cousin, simply looked away, choosing the comfortable anonymity of the family herd over basic human decency. Marion stood next to Silas, her arms crossed, nodding approvingly as if justice was finally being served. People often ask why victims of long-term financial and emotional abuse don't simply walk away. They see the open door and wonder why you remain in the room, but they don't understand the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a deeply ingrained psychological phenomenon known as learned helplessness. When you are conditioned from childhood to believe that you are a fundamental burden, that every bite of food and every piece of clothing is an insurmountable debt, your mind systematically rewires itself. You are trained to accept unjust punishment as the absolute baseline of your existence. The chains aren't made of iron. They are constructed from guilt, obligation, and the desperate, pathetic hope that if you just pay enough, work hard enough, and bleed enough, they might finally deem you worthy of love. I wasn't staying because I was inherently weak. I was staying because my survival mechanism was fundamentally broken. I handed the check to the clerk. The woman behind the thick glass looked at me with a mixture of pity and intense discomfort. She processed the payment, and the machine printed out the final, irreversible receipt. I had been the silent, unrecognized investor in this toxic enterprise, and this $35,000 check was my final, forced dividend. Silas walked up behind me and snatched the receipt from the counter before I could even reach for it. "Good girl," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "See? That wasn't so hard. You're finally learning how to be a productive, grateful member of this family." He waved the paper like a trophy, too blinded by his own arrogance to realize a basic legal fact. Because I paid with my personal check, the bill of sale and the bull's registry were now legally in my name. He had just forced me to officially buy back my own father's legacy. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. The transaction was complete, but the psychological ledger in my mind had just balanced out to zero. The learned helplessness completely evaporated the moment that money left my account. The invisible chains snapped. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a creditor, and I was about to collect. I watched Silas walk back to his wife and children, flaunting the receipt like a championship trophy. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were merely celebrating another successful extraction. What they didn't know was that they had just initiated their own absolute bankruptcy. Just as Silas waved the receipt, a sharp, authoritative voice echoed through the auction hall. "Bring that to me, Silas." The murmurs died instantly. My great-grandmother Eleanor, 82 years old, and the legendary founder of the cattle empire, stepped forward. Her posture was straight, her gaze like steel. She didn't yell. True power never has to raise its voice. Silas froze, his smug expression crumbling into a mask of sudden terror. Eleanor took the receipt from his hand without looking at him, placed her hand on my shoulder, and guided me out of the arena. We drove back to her sprawling estate in total silence. Once inside the oak-paneled study, she poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed me one. "Sit down, Clara. We have business to discuss." She sat across from me and laid out a series of legal documents. "I have pancreatic cancer," she stated clinically. "The doctors give me a few months at most. That is my deadline, and now it is yours." I stared at her, the shock overriding my anger. Eleanor had always been a distant, imposing figure. Why step in now? This is the silent regret of the guardian. For decades, Eleanor had watched her family rot from the inside. She had hoped that Silas and Marion would find their moral compass, trapped between the desire to protect her empire and the reluctance to destroy her own descendants. But her terminal diagnosis was the final alarm bell. She realized that waiting for bad people to become good was a fool's errand. Her inaction had cost me dearly, and this was her final, brutal attempt at redemption. "There is more," Eleanor continued, sliding a bank statement across the desk. 10 years ago, Marion and Silas sold the acreage you inherited from your parents. They forged the trust documents and embezzled exactly $1.5 million. They used your inheritance to build their own comfortable lives while you paid for your own veterinary schooling. The room spun. $1.5 million stolen, and that bull. Eleanor's voice turned to ice. The $35,000 bull Silas just forced you to buy? I reviewed the registry. It shares a direct bloodline with the rare breed your late father spent his entire life cultivating. Silas didn't just buy a bull to save face. He forced you to finance the erasure of your own father's legacy. The criminal twist hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't casual cruelty. This was premeditated, generational theft. If Eleanor had not stepped in, a world without her would have been my permanent reality. Silas and Marion would have continued to bleed me dry. I would have been their endless ATM, my clinic bankrupt, my spirit completely ground into dust. Without Eleanor's revelation, my father's legacy would have been erased, and I would have funded the demolition. I looked at the forged signatures, the stolen millions, and the deliberate insult to my father's memory. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened the financial dossier. This isn't revenge, I told her, my voice perfectly steady. It is accounting. Tell me what we need to do. The scandal detonated through the Texas agricultural community within 48 hours. Eleanor moved with the lethal precision of a corporate raider, leaking the audit reports and the forged land deeds directly to the state's most prominent cattle associations. The silence that had protected my aunt and uncle for decades was shattered. Desperation breeds stupidity. In a frantic attempt at damage control, my cousin Beatrice booked an interview on a highly popular agricultural podcast, hoping to leverage her carefully cultivated social media image. She wanted to play the victim, to paint Eleanor as a senile old woman manipulated by a greedy, adopted cousin. I didn't try to stop her. When your enemies are digging their own graves, the most strategic move is to simply hand them a larger shovel. I listened to the live broadcast from my clinic office. Beatrice started strong, deploying a soft, trembling voice. We took Clara in when she had nothing, she claimed, dabbing at invisible tears. We gave her a family, and now she's trying to steal my great-grandmother's estate. But the podcast host, a veteran agricultural journalist who had received Eleanor's leaked dossier, wasn't interested in a sob story. Beatrice, let's talk about the land sale. He pivoted sharply. Leaked financial audits appear to show that your parents allegedly liquidated $1.5 million from Clara's trust fund. Documents suggest your luxury vehicles and your college tuition were funded directly from those accounts. How do you respond to these allegations of embezzlement? Beatrice stammered. The panic in her voice was palpable. She wasn't prepared for facts. She was only prepared for theater. That money, that was family money. It was for the upkeep of the ranch. The documents show it was a legally protected trust. The host pressed relentlessly. If these records are accurate, your family took money meant for a grieving orphan. Were you aware of this alleged theft? The pressure broke her. Beatrice's carefully constructed victim persona completely dissolved, replaced by the ugly, entitled arrogance she had worn her entire life. Stolen? She shrieked into the microphone. We earned that money! We had to put up with her for 20 years. She was just an outsider, a charity case. We deserved every single penny of that trust fund for raising her ungrateful ass. The silence on the broadcast was absolute. She had just confessed to a massive financial crime on a live, syndicated audio feed. There was no walking it back. There was no public relations spin that could erase a direct admission of generational theft. I sat at my desk and closed my laptop. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that the world finally saw them doing it. The broadcast was clipped, shared, and downloaded tens of thousands of times before midnight. The public backlash was swift and merciless. Contracts were canceled. Lines of credit were immediately frozen by the local banks. Beatrice had wanted an audience to validate her delusions. Instead, she had single-handedly provided the prosecution with a recorded confession, destroying her family's reputation permanently in under 3 minutes. The legal battle wasn't a prolonged war. It was a swift, methodical execution. With Eleanor's airtight financial audits, the forensic evidence of the forged trust documents, and Beatrice's spectacular, self-incriminating podcast confession, Silas and Marion's defense attorneys had absolutely zero leverage. We moved through the Texas court system with ruthless clinical efficiency. I didn't attend the hearings seeking emotional closure or dramatic apologies. I attended strictly to ensure the asset transfers and injunctions were legally bulletproof. Eleanor officially removed them from her trust, explicitly naming me as the sole controller of the estate upon her passing. Concurrently, Marion and Silas were indicted on multiple felony counts of criminal fraud and embezzlement. The judge ordered their immediate eviction from the main property and mandated the aggressive liquidation of their personal assets to repay the $1.5 million they had stolen, plus 2 decades of compounded interest. It is a fascinating psychological study to observe the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For my entire life, Silas, Marion, and Beatrice had walked around with unearned, suffocating arrogance. They firmly believed their superiority came from their bloodline and their inherent, unassailable worth. But reality teaches us the stark difference between having wealth and being a person of value. Their status was entirely leased, funded by stolen money and Eleanor's previously silent tolerance. They didn't possess actual character, professional resilience, or intellect. They merely possessed a hijacked bank account. Once the capital was legally seized, their entire personality collapsed. Stripped of their stolen wealth, they were nothing more than fragile, frightened people facing the brutal reality of their own mediocrity. The formal eviction took place on an exceptionally bright Tuesday morning. I stood on the porch of the main house, flanked by Eleanor's corporate attorneys, and watched the sheriff's deputies oversee the removal. Silas looked incredibly aged, his face gray and completely defeated. Marion wouldn't even meet my eyes. Warren stood quietly in the background, a ghost of a man who had never learned to think or provide for himself. The ultimate moment of accounting came when the repossession trucks arrived for Beatrice. She stood on the gravel driveway, screaming frantic obscenities as 2 deputies handed her the seizure paperwork for her customized luxury SUVs. The vehicles she had flaunted for years, purchased directly with the money stolen from my parents' land, were chained and towed away right in front of the local ranch hands and neighbors. Her public collapse was complete and absolute. "You planned this," Silas hissed at me as he carried a cheap cardboard box toward his rusted backup truck. "You manipulated a sick, dying woman to steal our family legacy." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual anger, just cold, clinical detachment. "You sold my father's legacy to buy a breeding bull and designer cars," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "I didn't steal your legacy, Silas. You never had one to begin with. This wasn't revenge. It was simply a foreclosure." Eleanor passed away quietly 3 weeks after the final court ruling. She died comfortably in her own bed, looking out over the sprawling Texas pastures she had built from absolutely nothing. I sat beside her and held her hand at the end. She didn't offer any dramatic final speeches or tearful confessions. She just looked at me, gave a firm, decisive nod of approval, and closed her eyes. The empire was secure, and her watch was finally over. With the estate firmly in my control, I went straight to work. I didn't waste my time or energy gloating over my aunt and uncle's looming criminal trials, or Beatrice's spectacular bankrupt social collapse. That is the fundamental difference between the justice of the punisher and the justice of the planter. Punitive justice looks constantly backward, entirely obsessed with making the guilty bleed, but the justice of the planter looks exclusively forward. It recognizes that true, lasting victory isn't found in the absolute destruction of your enemies, but in the fertile, thriving ground you actively cultivate from their ashes. I used the recovered stolen funds to officially establish the Eleanor Foundation. We began providing full-ride educational scholarships and advanced technical grants for low-income veterinary students. I didn't want any other aspiring professional to have to choose between their passion and their basic survival. I also went back to the original auction records. I tracked down the exact lineage of that $35,000 bull and systematically repurchased the remaining livestock connected to my father's original herd. I brought them all back to the main pastures. I completely restored the legacy that Silas had so casually tried to erase, ensuring that my father's rare breed would thrive and multiply under the Texas sun once more. Letting go of bloodlines and finding oneself is a terrifying, magnificent process. Society constantly dictates that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract defined purely by shared DNA. But DNA does not excuse ongoing abuse. DNA is not a permanent license to exploit, to demean, or to systematically steal. When you finally find the unwavering courage to sever those highly toxic ties, you don't actually lose a family. You lose a cage. I had spent 22 grueling years believing my fundamental worth was dictated by small-minded people who viewed me strictly as a financial liability. Walking away from them didn't just save my sanity, it allowed me to properly introduce myself to the resilient, capable woman I was actually meant to be. I am no longer the quiet charity case. I am the CEO, the lead veterinarian, and the sole, uncompromising architect of my own destiny. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy anchor of resentment. But forgiveness unequivocally does not mean granting them access. I forgive them for being broken, deeply flawed people who were blinded by their own greed, but I will never, under any circumstances, allow them near my hard-earned peace ever again. To anyone listening right now who has always felt like the permanent outsider, this is my sincere letter to those on the fringe. I know the unique, quiet agony of sitting at a crowded dinner table surrounded by biological relatives and feeling completely, utterly alone. I know the bone-deep exhaustion of constantly trying to prove your basic worth to people who are absolutely determined to misunderstand and minimize you. You are not broken just because they cannot properly love you. You are not a heavy burden just because they refuse to carry their own emotional weight. Your fundamental value is not determined by the deeply insecure people who consistently mistreat you. Stop waiting for the validation of those who actively profit from your insecurity. Walk away. Build your own table. Cultivate your own vibrant pasture. And always remember that the most profound, devastating revenge is simply becoming everything they explicitly said you could never be and happily watching them fade into absolute, irreversible irrelevance while you spectacularly thrive. I stood alone on the expansive porch of the main house, looking out over the endless green expanse of my newly reclaimed property. The rare cattle grazed peacefully near the winding creek. The afternoon sun was incredibly warm on my face. There was no screaming, no belittling comments, no hidden financial agendas. There was only the gentle wind moving through the tall grass, the restored legacy of my true family, and the profound, unbreakable silence of my own absolute freedom. If this story of justice and resilience resonated with you, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode of Revenge Mode.